Chapter 18, The Last Egret. We built a big fire near the biggest shell pile and sat around it. No one said much, but we all kept our guns closed and kept our eyes peeled on the forest around us. As the dark fell, it seemed we heard all manner of noises in the water and the trees, and once we all jumped when Guy yelled, "There!" and swore that he saw red eyes glaring at us in the dark. "It's just an animal," Lily said. "You act like you've never seen a raccoon in the dark." Bandit scampered across her arm as she said it and looked at Guy accusingly. Guy just muttered and shifted closer to the fire. "So are you guys really going to shoot those birds tomorrow?" Lily asked. "Yep," Guy said. "That's what we came all this ways for." "But they're so pretty," said Lily, "and we've barely seen any snowy egrets. I mean, I can understand you shooting the herons and things that we got close by home, but how do you know that's not every snowy egret left in the world?" "That's just a girl thing to say," Louis answered. "Of course there's more than just those." "How do you know?" Lily asked. "Anyway, don't you think some things are just too pretty to be shot at?" I could tell Lily was getting herself worked up. I wasn't too worried about that, but I was worried about Tiger. He was staring gloomily into the fire. "Come on, everybody," I interrupted. "It's getting late. We better turn in for the night." Tiger volunteered to keep the first watch, so the rest of us arranged our blankets in a circle around the fire, head to toe, and went to sleep. I woke up when it was my turn to keep watch and sat wrapped in my blanket. The fire had already died down to embers, and I jumped at every night sound. I was startled once by glowing red eyes from across the fire until I realized it was only Bandit staring at me from where he had nestled next to Lily. I was just dozing off when I was jerked awake by a sad, singular cry. I couldn't tell where it came from or what had made it. It sounded like a bird, but it was deeper and echoed through the forest. I thought it was just about the saddest sound I'd ever heard, and I had a hard time falling back to sleep after that. I wondered what kind of animal sat up at night in the middle of all this great, beautiful, lonely swamp and made such sad cries. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud, angry voices. I sat up quickly and saw Tiger and Lily squared off against Guy and Louie. Everybody was arguing with each other. "Give it back!" Guy said, grabbing for Lily, but she danced backward out of the way. I jumped up and ran over to see what was going on. "She's got the bag of shells," Guy said as soon as I came up. "She says she's going to throw them in the water if we leave to go kill them snowy egrets." "You shouldn't kill those birds," Lily said hotly. The pouch full of shotgun shells was hanging behind her back. "Lily," I said, "give back the shells. What are you doing? You can't take our shells." "We don't think you should go hunting today," Lily said. Her face was stubbornly set, and I recognized the expression from when she ran away from school. "We?" I said. "Who's we?" "Me and Tiger," Lily said. "Right, Tiger? Didn't you say they shouldn't kill any more birds?" Tiger looked miserably at the dirt and didn't answer, but I could tell from his expression what he thought. "You didn't really say that, did you, Tiger?" Guy demanded. "'Cause that would be just stupid. We came all this way to get plumes, so why would you just give up like that? Now give back those shells." "No," Lily said. "Tell him, Tiger. Tell him what you said." "No," I said. "It's all right, Tiger. You don't have to come." Tiger looked up at me, and there was relief on his face. But something else, too. He looked upset. "But you know we've got to go," I said. "Right? You know that." Tiger didn't say anything, but he shook his head just a tiny bit from side to side, and it was just as good as if he'd yelled, "You don't have to go." Angry now, I turned to Lily. "Give me the shells, Lily, right now." "You ain't Papa, Charlie," she said. "You can't boss me around any way you want. We say you shouldn't go. We say..." "Lily," I said quietly, "I told you why we need that money. Now give me back the shells, or whatever happens will be on you." I knew it was a cheap shot as soon as Lily's eyes filled up with tears, but I was too angry just then to care, and I snatched the big sack of shells away from her as soon as she offered it. "Now come on," I grilled at Guy and Louie. "Let's go." Neither Tiger nor Lily said anything as we loaded the canoe. We set off into the warm water, wading across the half-mile of sawgrass to find the snowy egrets. I didn't know what Guy and Louie were thinking, but it was with a heavy heart that I waded through the slowly moving water toward the big tree where the snowy egrets buzzed and fluttered. It took us the better part of 3 hours to cross that section of sawgrass. There was a deep channel in the middle, so we had to swim across one by one and then rig the canoe on a line and pull it after us. After that, we still had another hour of waiting ahead of us, and sometimes the sawgrass grew up so tall that I knew which direction we were heading only by looking at the sun overhead. Finally, we started to climb into shallow water, and we saw the first trees of the cypress forest that sat between us and the rookery. We got our first look at the rookery, and Louie was right. There were more birds there than a person could count. The whole tree was covered with them, as if it were wearing a white coat that shook in the heavy breeze. Even from this distance, the white of the plumage was dazzling beyond description. Then we headed into the cypress forest. We had seen some beautiful woods before now, but nothing like this place. The cypress soon gave way to fig trees that had buttress roots as tall as my head, and more roots hanging down to latch onto the ground like so many legs. And there were gumbo-limbo here too, with their trunks and branches bright red and peeling like sunburned skin. As we climbed higher, we entered a stand of live oak that was hung with Spanish moss like an old man's beard, and orchids and air plants clung to the tree's rough bark. It was like a fantasy described in a fairy tale, and I half expected the flowers and trees to come to life and start talking to us. I'd lived in wild places most of my life, but I'd never seen a place like this. It almost seemed like God was showing off his beauty and magic, and I wondered if the snowy egrets chose this spot for their rookery because it was the most beautiful place on earth. We cleared the last of the oak and headed back into the water toward the tiny island where a single huge tree towered above the surrounding landscape and was covered with snowy egrets. Suddenly, in the presence of all that majesty, I was overcome with doubts. What if Lily was right? What if these were the only snowy egrets left in the world? I remembered Jumper Osceola's face as he talked about the kunti and the plume birds. He was angry, but it was more than that. He was sad, too. Some things, once they're lost, you can never get them back. I tried to shake my head clear as Guy and Louie and I figured out the best way to attack the rookery. Just like before, we wanted to set up shooting angles so that we could get as many birds as possible as fast as we could. I bet we get 500 birds, Louie said excitedly. But all I could picture was 500 skinned carcasses piled up back at camp, and Tiger looking at me over the fire with the same expression on his face that Jumper Osceola wore. "You okay, Charlie?" Guy asked quietly. I looked at him and tried to grin, but it came out a little wrong. "Sure," I said. "Let's just go." We waded out and split up to take our positions. Just as we did at Lettuce Lake, the others were supposed to wait for my signal so that we could all start firing at once. I crept quietly through the sawgrass until I reached shallow water near the rookery. Guy and Louie were wading into position also. I took my time loading up the first shell and arranging my pouch with fresh shells. Then I looked up the tree and really saw snowy egrets up close for the first time. I'd never seen a bird as dazzling white, with such large and breathtaking feathers. Many of them were sitting on nests, and I could hear tiny chicks peeping at their parents. It was as if the orchids of the jungle had come to life, and then, for no reason in particular, I heard Papa's voice in my head saying, "I don't want to be killing things we don't need to kill." I remembered how the Seminoles looked around their fire, talking about how white men had destroyed all kunti plants, and I remembered how all those camps in Pahaoki had smelled when they were full of dead birds. I knew that if we shot these birds, we'd end up creating another pile of dead birds that we couldn't eat and leaving all those chicks to die, just so a bunch of ladies I never met could put feathers on their hats. I had been raised to eat what I killed, not to throw away God's creations like so many used rags. I could feel the frustration rising. It seemed that every person I loved and respected, my papa, Tiger, the Seminoles, even Lily, was lined up in my head telling me this was wrong. And the only person who thought it was right was John Samuelson, a man I hadn't even liked very much when I met him. I felt as if I was making a choice. Did I want to grow up to be a man like Papa or a man like John Samuelson? That was the final straw. Before I could think about it any more, I raised my gun up, straight up into the air, and let a blast go into the blue sky. There must have been something in that first shell I loaded, because it was the loudest gun blast I'd ever heard. The echo rolled across the open swamp and seemed to bounce along the trees for a minute or more. All at once, the white coat of birds covering the massive trees seemed to lift up in the air like it was shedding a skin. The egrets hung in the air for a single heartbeat, so white they almost glowed, and then the birds streaked off in every direction. "Hey!" Louis yelled, and he managed to get off 3 or 4 blasts at the fleeing birds, but I didn't see any fall. I smiled at the sight of Louis running back and forth at top speed, trying to load while he was still running and aiming at birds but not hitting any. Guy, too, was smiling, sitting with his gun draped over his arm. When our eyes met, he nodded at me as if to say he understood what I had done. The flock filled the sky for only a minute, with the early morning sun glinting off their glorious, valuable plumage, and then in an instant they were gone, the last egret streaking away across the great Everglades.